Maybe also some rats are less talkative. Also, someone mentioned that if rats are alone, they also vocalize more. And also in a group, some rats talk, some don't. And I'm just wondering if there's analogy with people. The same happens if we have a group of people. Some talk more, some talk less. I don't know if they are leaders or just more talkative people. Just wondering if this is similar in rats or not. Thank you.
I may try to answer that question. Do you hear me?
Yes.
I actually have shown one of the slides which shows so-called different lines of rats. Those were rats selected depending on how vocal they are during the play. And some of them are very vocal, some other not. It is exactly the same as in humans. This is dependent on individual abilities of the rats, individual, in quotation mark, personality. So we see that in rats, as from our laboratory, and Jeff Burgdorf also have seen that there are animals which are sometimes very vocal, sometimes not, and this is their own nature without any stimulation.
Okay, thank you.
I would agree, and from our results also show that there are rats that talk a lot, and there are rats that are completely mute. We had one in our group, and I would, as you asked, I would confirm that those that were alone before, in our case, that were kept in single cages, they would vocalize more when exposed to playback. And this question is, I think, important in the field, and I would really like to hear your opinion on what to do with this variability that we encounter. So there is a lot of variability between individual animals and their level of vocalization. Some vocalize a lot, some vocalize really, really rarely. We can induce it chemically. We can pre-select some individuals that vocalize and others that don't. Maybe you have other ideas how to deal with that problem.
Well, this is well-known phenomenon in science that we have overcome this variability by creating large groups of animals for our study. That's why we do not study 1, 2, or 3 individuals, but groups of 30 or more individuals to overcome that. And in such group, probably from statistical point of view, about 30 or more, there will be some which are poorly responding and some which are over responding, and the rest will be just right. So this is the only way to overcome that. The other would be to selecting the individuals, but this is very time consuming and difficult, and I don't think this is the way to go. We simply should take larger groups and expecting that there will be some outstanding animals overlaying on each end of the spectrum.
Yes, and of course there's also opportunity to study degradation of the vocalization. So when we've got animals that vocalize very less, so those low vocalizers and those high vocalizers, and between them we've got some kind of gradation of this vocalization, and then we can measure or search what are the biological backgrounds of those reactions. If I can continue this question, I would like to ask if we can compare the mouse vocalization. Is it the same, the mouse vocalization and the rat's vocalization? Because I was studying the mouse vocalization by a few months in this year, and it looks completely different. They vocalize in the different situation, and most of those situations were the situation with the some kind of dominance or hierarchy. And in rats, it looks quite different.
Jeffrey, please unmute yourself. You're first.
Sure. First, let me lower my hand. I wanted just to take a half step back to the variability question. I think what I've moved to doing is, really looking at ethologically induced vocalization, so home cage recordings. So what I like to do is, while the animals are in the home cage, undisturbed, no experimenter, probably the first hour after the lights turn on, the animals are very active, and that's when you really get a lot of vocalizations. And I find that tends to be less variable and more consistent between the animals. And then the second part is, I think the question of mouse versus rat is the key question, honestly. It's very clear that all of the science of how to go from the careful work of organs tracing a circuit, and how do you come up with a detailed circuit, or how do you look at genetic abnormalities, that has to be done in mice. And I think a lot of researchers struggle with that question. The good example is the aversive call, which you saw from the video, is very clear in a rat. It's very clear that they're having some sort of negative affective state, and it's very robust. And to be able to capture that in a mouse, we've had some other symposiums where people have suggested that there might be an analog to the 20 kilohertz call. I've been able to look at that in my own hands. There may be some signal there, but it's awfully subtle. It's an awfully subtle change in vocalizations, vocalization type. I think that the mice just seem to have, the frequency modulated 50 kilohertz variation, and not so much the aversive call.
Okay, Marcus, you're holding your hand.
Yeah, maybe I can add to that. So we are working with both mice and rats actually, and I think we need to keep in mind that mice are not just small rats. I mean, sounds obvious, but I mean, feels like sometimes this is forgotten. So there's actually many differences between mice and rats, particularly in terms of behavior. For instance, rough and tumble play. So rough and tumble play works very well in rats. So they show very strong rough and tumble play behavior. It's a very prominent part of their behavioral repertoire as juveniles in particular. Then this is also one of the reasons why tickling works so well in rats. It's super easy. I mean, you need some training, but it's super easy to tickle rats. They really like it. They show strong following behavior, so strong approach behavior. And I personally, I never try to tickle a mouse, and there's a reason for that. So, so mice and rats are different. And one prominent difference, of course, is that mice lack the aversive 22 kilohertz call. So when we started working on ultrasonic vocalizations, which is now, I would say almost 20 years ago, we did quite an extensive study on fear conditioning in mice, because we wanted to know whether mice produce these aversive 22 kilohertz calls. So we did a very intense fear conditioning paradigm, high shock intensities, many factors that we varied and so on, but we never saw aversive 22 kilohertz call like signals in mice. So we never saw that. They sometimes produced a vocalization, particularly when we took them out of the fear conditioning box, but they were more similar to the high frequency calls around between 60, 70, 80 kilohertz. So we tried a lot. We never saw real 22 kilohertz calls in mice, and I'm very hesitant. In terms of, I really don't think that they exist in mice. But of course, if somebody finds them, please let me know. I would be very curious. So, so because of these differences, I think it's mice and rats, they have advantages. And particularly, for instance, for all the genetic work, we do most of our genetic work we do in mice for obvious reasons. Jeff mentioned that. For studies we focus on social behavior. Most of the studies we actually do in rats because of their richer social behavior repertoire. And this is also, I think, one of the reasons why there's now more and more models for autism, rat models for autism, because there's a lot more to study in rats than in mice. So yeah, both have advantages, disadvantages, but we need to keep in mind that mice are not just small rats.
Okay, so we've got another question by Elodie. I will allow you to talk now. So if you can please please unmute yourself and ask it yourself.
Yeah. Hello. I just have a general question, might be quite naive, but for the models in which we study ultrasonic vocalization as a proxy for social communication, in fact, we can only speak about a kind of a proxy for internal state or motivation for social interactions, but not more. And then, if that's the case, do you have any hypothesis about why there are so many different call types and so on?
There is a general rule that the number of calls emitted by the animals in social life is dependent on the organization of social life. Animals which are living in larger groups and more elaborate social groups, they emit more calls, larger number of calls, and more elaborate calls, and they have some gradation in different sort and type of calls. Now, animals which are creating smaller groups, social groups, emitting less vocalization, and the repertoire is smaller. Those which are almost solitude, they still vocalize, but the vocalizations are rather poor and almost limited to reproductive situations. The difference between rats and mice is interesting because both of them have quite large social groups. So from that point of view, they should have the same repertoire of calls and the same sorts of calls. However, there is very large difference between rats and mice, not in number of individuals in groups, but in organization of social groups. And that is probably the reason, probably because I am not sure, why the structure and way of communication in mice by ultrasonic calls is so different than in rats. That's what I can say from studies which I did in the past.
I can give you a quite naive answer, and then maybe you could either agree or disagree. So that would depend on what you want to measure or what you wanted to check, whether you're interested in positive or negative effect, right? Or the motivation. I mean, this is basically what you're trying to quantify. So I'd say it would depend on the study. Would you have a comment, maybe?
I was just I was just thinking of the fact that maybe communication would have an influence on the behavior of the other animal. And here, from the preliminary data that we have with Fabrice, for instance, we don't see a lot of differences in the context of the different call types. So it's quite difficult, for instance, in the mouse to get this. And from what I know, even in the organization of the different call types, from what has been done before, there is no clear rule also, which might help to find any pattern or something like that. And so this is just thoughts.
I don't know if someone tried to do some playback experiments with mice. Maybe this will help. To understand if it's really some kind of communication between mice. For example, in case of cats, we know that cats do not meow do not vocalize when they are together. I got two cats in at home. When they will be vocalizing a lot, I want them stay at home, and maybe it's quite the same in the mice. I don't know if someone tried to emit sounds to the mice. We know, for example, in birds, they communicate each other. Many birds also can filter some information from the vocalization, yes, and also some kind of name. They can call each other by the name, yes. So it's really quite different.
I'm gonna allow to talk also Professor Schwarting. Would you like to? Because I see your hand.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is more kind of a comment which goes to Robert Kuba. First of all, I want to congratulate you for your playback recordings and your setups. There's not so much work with playback, and I think it's important to use different kinds of devices, environments to test them. And overall, one bottom line from your talk for me, and I think for researchers wanting to work with playback, is that you always have to consider an interaction with at least three factors. One is the stimulus material, the second is the context, and the third is the history of the animal. For example, its social status or how it was treated well or not, and so on. I think this is really important. This is also relevant, of course, for recording USV, but in case of playback, I think it becomes especially important. That was my comment.
Okay, Marcus, would you like to give a further comment?
I actually wanted to give an answer to Elodie's question. I think it's a very good question Elodie is asking. So, and I'm very much impressed by the approach they are using in the lab to link the many different types of vocalizations to the behavior of the mice. I think this is the way to go. And from there, we can then ask whether these vocalizations have different meanings and so on. So I think we really should work with the animals. And in this particular context, I think it makes a lot of sense also to use fancy tools such as machine learning and so on, supervised learning and so on, because I think together with the animals, we can learn a lot from that. But actually, I think the question is not that trivial because it's actually quite a difficult question. And the answer using playback is also not that easy because, I mean, we did a lot of playback experiments in rats and we also did playback experiments in mice. And in my experience, it's a lot more difficult to evoke behavioral responses in mice compared to rats. So I showed you the video of one rat today, for example, and with only one animal, you can immediately see that the animal is responding. And also in Robert Kuba's presentation today, it was the same. I mean, you could see it immediately when the playback was turned on. And in mice, I mean, this was never the case to me, at least for the vocalizations that I used. So juvenile adult vocalizations. It might be different for the pup vocalizations. They might elicit a very strong response in the mother, and there's a lot of groups using these vocalizations to elicit strong behavioral responses in the mother. But I mean, for the vocalizations that Elodie is recording, I think it's it's quite challenging actually, and would be very interesting to see what happens. And of course, it would be good to take all the 3 points that Lionel just mentioned into account because, I agree, they are super relevant.
Okay, Jeffrey, would you like to?
Sure, I wanted to go back to the great concept, I think we should talk about it, of the stimulus, the context, and the history of the animal. And I think that actually varies in the circuit. This is absolutely critical for, when we're talking about like stimulation, absolutely critical for the medial prefrontal cortex. You need the right context, you need the right history of the animal. But when you're in the PAG and you're stimulating, it doesn't seem to matter at all. You see, that seems to just be an automatic response. When you stimulate, it's bound no matter what the state of the animal is. And it tends not to potentiate. So I wonder at what point, I sort of have this concept of, which we get from organs, that the PAG is kind of the output. And then here at the medial prefrontal cortex, you have this complex, multimodal inducer that requires subtlety. And I wonder if there's gradients between the medial prefrontal cortex and the output that are sort of in between.
Okay, so we have another question, again by Alicia. Alicia, I'm gonna unmute you.
Just before,
sorry, I see raised hand.
I just would like to follow up on the Marcus comment, just to know. Well, so do you believe that, considering what we know with the mice communication, do they really communicate, or do they only perform signaling by what they are saying? So it's just to go forward on the question of Elodie, because as it was the idea behind this. So do we really need to find a reaction with the other, or does it just show that? Yeah, it's about the same question. But well, so would you say signaling instead of communicating?
Am I supposed to answer? So, well, actually, I don't know the answer. Of course, I would expect that the vocalizations emitted by one animal is eliciting a response in the other animal. I just hope that our tools right now are just not good enough to make that happen. So I hope in the future with your fancy tools, for instance, that we can learn a lot more, and then using that knowledge that we can actually elicit behavioral responses, strong behavioral responses in the mice as well. So that's what I'm hoping. But honestly, I don't know the answer.
Okay, so I think Alicia, you may ask your question now.
Okay, thank you. I will simply read what I have written regarding correlations. Professor Dechaumont mentioned correlations of mice vocalization with special type of peeing. So there.
We can't hear you, so I'm just going to read it. Okay.
Vocalization, so some kind of language.
Okay, we lost you for a moment, so I'm going to just reread the question.
Let me repeat. So there is research saying what kind of vocalization is produced in mice related to some special activities, like special type of peeing. And I'm just wondering if there is such research on rat, I mean, if there is a correlation of specific type of vocalization regarding to, for example, seeing food, seeing some kind of specific food, specific danger. So I mean, if there is, I would say, some kind of language for communication, just something more than expressing emotions. Is there any research on correlations between specific actions, I mean, not just expressing emotions, but trying to expressing a message between rats? And since I have seen this video with rats, which were rats or mice, which were stimulated by light, and it was quite a big device. So maybe if there is a possibility to have such a device on an animal, maybe it's also possible to have microphones on animals, because in this case we don't have to bother about specifying which voice belongs to which animal. Maybe that would be easier if we could have input marks, it belongs to rat A, rat B, and so on. Okay, thank you.
Okay, if you just let me, I will allow Dr. Reiner to talk because I noticed his hand.
Yes, me again, sorry. This time the question is to Pavel and Fabrice. And I mean, I totally agree that we know that we need systems to analyze vocalizations because of their numbers, because of their complexities and so on. But for me, the problem is how can a small lab decide what to use? There are no test magazines which compare the systems. I mean, there are publications who compare them. And when I decide to hire somebody to do this, usually the guy or the woman says, yes, yeah, I could do this, I could implement this, but I can do a better one. And then you have another one. And how long should we do this? I mean, at a certain level, we have to decide on kind of a gold standard or something which is accepted in publications. Yeah, this basically, it's a kind of a question.
I think that's a good point. Having a system which is open and widely accepted, we just have to create such a system, such a way, such a procedure. And if we just add up our knowledge to build such a system, plus some hardware and software that we can build on, we can create some kind of platform. And because right now, this is one of the idea for my laboratory. And so I will try to, at least for a couple of years, push this forward, and we will see. Maybe we'll end up with some really universal system that we can all use with very little costs. And without this problem that some clever guy just make a system, then disappear, switches to different field, and just go away, which is usually the way.
Hey, Kuba.
Thank you. Okay, couple of things. One thing is, let's not forget about Alicia's question. So regarding, correlation between particular types or kinds of ultrasound vocalizations and their meaning or their situation when they're expressed. So there are, answering you is that there are several publications that try to correlate those, but I don't think there is a overall agreement in the field that certain vocalizations bear certain meanings that we're not there yet. And I have a provocative thought. I hope it's provocative, that overall we're looking in the wrong place. So we're doing exactly what you're suggesting. So we're trying to correlate certain vocalizations with certain aspects of behavior or of behavioral situations or presence of food, as you mentioned exactly. And some people see something, and I don't think it's really that often repeated. But what I think is that we should be looking more into the conversations, into the meaning that's in exchange of vocalizations between animals, and that's what we're trying to figure out using playback experiments. So we can control one side of vocal exchange and see if there is some meaning in actual exchange itself, and not in particular sounds or types correlated with particular situations. We might not find anything, but that's our goal now. That's one point. Another point is Pavel's idea of developing technology and pushing it forward, as he put it. I would encourage all ourselves to team up with. I don't know where to go with that team, but I'm with you guys. I would like really to do things that we can do together as a field and push together as a field so that we don't have to stumble alone in the darkness and figure out things by ourselves. The thing that I would like to propose, and apart from technological advances that we can coordinate, what do you guys think about like naming what we're doing? We kind of stumble. What are the parts of the vocalizations? What is the song? What's the note? It's maybe we can agree on that. I don't think there is like one agreed upon way of naming what we actually investigating. So there are major reviews, but do we really agree on which is the key one? And maybe we can also again team up and, for example, work on this naming the structure of vocalizations, both in rats and mice, for example. That's just the idea. Thank you.
And also, if I can say a word, you also mentioned communication. I think vocalization, it's not everything, because they are moving, they are doing some movement. So some kind of message is also passed through their, I would say, body language, right? Thank you.
Body language is great, but as I was saying during my talk, body language from or maybe I didn't say it anyway, in the burrows or underground tunnels, when rats are far away from each other, the body language is zero, is limited. You can't see each other. However, of course, if when you interact and there is a couple of rats interacting, there's a lot of body language, obviously.
Especially if they fight, there is body language.
I would like to have the opportunity to answer the question of the detection on how to get the best method and so on. Is that okay? So, well, I've already been in this field of having a benchmark to say what is the best solution in image analysis, for instance, just to detect little spots in images. And I had organized this kind of challenge. And we had to do so because everybody came with a method claiming, okay, we are 99% okay with our detection, so you can't beat us. And of course, when you put a new method to the editor and the editor says, okay, you don't make a breakthrough because people are already having 99% and you're just saying 99.1, it's just increasing, so it's not interesting. And the problem is that, in fact, today's method should not be more than, I don't know, 40% or something like that, because in fact, we're really lacking a lot of information that we extract from the signal. So I thought about something 1 year ago about having a platform to have a lot of vocalization from people, because the problem that you have when you want to create a benchmark is that you need to have a lot of vocalization that are labelized so that you can play against ground truth. And if you don't have it, it's difficult. And then comes the problem of diversity, because if you are recording pups in a small cage at that distance of the pup without anything in the background and a pure noise, I mean, no noise at all, then the detection challenge is absolutely different from, for instance, the one that we do in an area where there's a lot of things, and even more in area where you really put the housing with cotton and so on, that is completely suppressing the sounds. So at some point, what I wanted to make it short, but what I would have think is to have a website, something like that. And I was thinking about, let's put all the, let's say 15 best method within this website on virtual machine and so on, so that people can come and put their own method, so that when you upload a WAV file, just like our website, you don't only run ours, but you run all of them. And then in the end, you can choose the one that is fitting exactly your needs, because some are specialized for nose, some are specialized for pups, and some for rats maybe, and some other for the other. And I was also thinking that it would be great to differentiate the detection part and the labeling part, so that if I want to use the dictionary of Cuba, I don't need maybe I like this one. I don't want to use the one of somebody else, but it would be just great to have all the dictionary, and in the end, you have a label that is, I don't know, a bell wave, whatever, with the name of the creator and its version, because each time you release a system that is detecting sounds, it is just like a timestamp, and somehow it's difficult to bring changes to your detection, because people rely on your previous detection. They don't want you to change it because they want it to be repeated. And so what would be great is that, okay, I run this detection at this version. So you see, it's a whole structure. And in the end, what is difficult, because I dismiss from this idea, is that you will not have a reward for this. And the other very last effect that is very bad with this problem of benchmarking is that then people from the physics community, they will come and they will take all your data set as a reference, and they will train something deep on this data set, and they will beat whoever is coming because they are overtrained over your data set. And then if you come with new data, they will be down again, but you will already have damaged the community, because you will lock the new incomer with a new method. It will not be able to come because of this. Okay, I've been very, very long. Just to say it's a complex question.
Yeah, that's what my thoughts were exactly, because the language in human is, you know, kind of an expression, but more of a social contract construct, let's say. And then there are rats who are, you know, more simple animals, let's say. However, I wonder, I'm pretty sure it would be a question to Jeffrey, because even if we, I don't know, could study that this vocalization actually is a pattern because it's consistent of some, in some particular, or always happens in some particular situations, you know, social or regardless. Do you think that would improve your knowledge over those affective states that you study? Because I mean, we all, you know, study this communication usually in order to, you know, mostly to find some solutions, let's say, for some human diseases. I know not everybody, but still this would be the majority of research. So would you say that even if you had a language, let's say, would you use it?
Yeah, so I'll answer that question. I also attend, you know, symposiums on how to measure emotions in humans and in animals. You know, and I think that there's an overwhelming, really an overwhelming consensus that we need objective measures. We need to be looking at behavior and objective ethological behaviors of people and not self-report, because the self-report data is just really unreliable. You know, those, just to add a little bit more color, those self-report measures were developed in the early usually the early 1960s. We really haven't changed much. So it's not really, I don't necessarily think of it as can you get objective behavior to correlate with self-report. I just think that the objective behavior really is the data, and the self-report is kind of a sloppy piecemeal half solution that was created a number of years ago, and we really haven't come up with a good way to get past it. Hopefully I answered your question.
Adam?
Yes. About this, I got the sentence about the technology, yes, because all of us are rather using the Avisoft microphones, and when we want to discriminate the sound source or find the sound source, it is quite difficult to do some kind of multilateralization in the cage. We've made some recordings on your system, in the LMT on 4 microphones, and there was. In each microphone there was a little bit difference in the shape, and we are concentrating on the shape of this of those sounds. And when we took the common signal from the 4 microphones, then we got the real. I don't know if it's real, but the common pattern of ultrasonic vocalization. Maybe we can use some other microphones for detecting those sounds, because all of them are directional microphones, not condenser microphones. And we found those microphones. I show you this microphones, Fabrice, and I hope your next system will show us which animal is vocalizing during the social interaction. And it's rather common than a question.
It's funny because I know, Adam, that you are very involved in having the identity of the animal, and it is a question that I had during my talk. But well, for the other talks, we didn't see the need of having it at the moment. But yeah, I will keep you in touch anyway for our progress about this, and I hope that we will have a device. But you know, we're going for the beginning. We're going to equip the animal with something easy to clip on the animal, nothing invasive. But so we will do this, and I will keep you all posted. It would be cool to have a kind of a mailing list with not mailing list. I don't know, but all the participants and all this panel of people, I guess it's a resource as a community.
Jeffrey?
Oh, perfect. Mm-hmm.
I've made some progress with an implantable microphone and EMG electrode, being able to discriminate which animal is vocalizing. I also am more hopeful that you know, some of these high frequency or high density video recordings would be able to pick that up in conjunction with some of these physiological measures.
Okay, we have another question already, or a comment. Please go, Dr. Reiner.
Yes, it's me again. Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Sorry for being so repetitive, but I think we don't have a social afterwards with beer, so I have to ask all my questions or my comments now. And so this one now is my personal master question, and this is the issue of emotion. I mean, in this community, we talk a lot about the relationship between the vocalizations and certain emotional states, and there are many, many good reasons to do so, no argument. But aren't there cases where the relationship is not that strong? And so as a side aspect, I would ask Richard, for example, whether, because he came from feathers, whether he's somehow surprised that we are talking so much about emotions. And the other part of my question goes to Nicola, because apomorphine and amphetamine are very good to elicit 50 kilohertz calls. Amphetamine is a drug of abuse, and one might assume, okay, maybe this reflects the euphoric state. But apomorphine is not really a good drug of abuse. And why couldn't another explanation hold? For example, maybe the vocalizations in these cases are stereotypies, because these drugs have typical patterns of very well-known patterns of stereotypies. Maybe in this case, there is no meaning behind it. It's simply a stereotypy. So two different things. One is, how somebody coming from a different background is seeing the emotion discussion, and the other is the question whether USVs are always reflections of emotional states.
Yes, I am. Surprised. No, I'm a total outsider to rodent vocalizations, and my approach both in bird and rodent has been really like mechanical, nuts and bolts, circuit-based approach. We, in a sense, have had to struggle with this more recently in bird, where we have a story in press that is imaging in basal ganglia circuitry during different social contexts that birds sing in, one where they're isolated and another in which they're singing to a female. And at least in terms of calcium signals, the difference in basal ganglia activity in a specialized part of the basal ganglia, important to singing in birds, it's night and day. It's highly elevated when the bird is alone, and it's starkly suppressed when the bird is singing to a female. And so for us, the questions become, what are the drivers? What can you associate that with? Arousal, motivation, reward? All of those presumably differ in those two different social contexts. So that's as close as we've come in my group to even pondering things that might be relevant to considering emotion. But I operate kind of in a framework. I think, Robert Seyfried had a, way of thinking about vocalizations in primates as being driven certainly by emotion, but with no intent. That it's a sign or an effector of emotional state, but there's no intentionality to it. So in the mouse circuit analysis we're doing, I think, some of the comments about, for example, Jeffrey's discussion of medial prefrontal cortex, I think that's right on. We simply got into the circuit through the PAG. That was kind of a midpoint of entry for the reasons I discussed. But what becomes obvious right away when you do the rabies tracing out of a gating element like that in the brain is how much convergence there is. And if single output neurons or population, a defined population of output neurons determines whether or not the animal will vocalize and what type of vocalizations will be made, then it must be weighing a huge amount of information about whether or not to make that decision. I think that I guess includes consideration of emotion.
Well, for my part of the question, I can say that I basically agree with the objection because, first of all, apomorphine, it is true that apomorphine is not a pure drug of abuse, but it does have some rewarding properties. Actually, for example, it induces praise preference. It can be self-administered by rats under certain conditions. But what I would like to say is that I think that vocalizations recorded in animals treated with drugs may not have exactly the same significance of the vocalizations that are recorded in animals during social interaction. The hypothesis that some vocalizations, for example, in the case of rats treated with apomorphine, stem from a hyperstimulation of dopamine receptor is something that we have already hypothesized in our previous articles. For example, in the one that is published in European Neuropsychopharmacology. I do agree that there may be some non-specific effect, especially when drugs are administered at high doses, like the doses of apomorphine we have used, especially 4 milligram per kilogram, is a moderate to high dose, and it can induce stereotype behavior, for example. And another thing I would like to mention is that the ratio between trill and flat vocalizations, for example, in animals treated with amphetamine and apomorphine, in our laboratory, we observe a lot of flat vocalization. So there are many papers that have reported that an index of amphetamine rewarding properties is the ratio between trill and flat vocalization, but nobody has actually ever demonstrated that this relates to reward. This is something that is always mentioned in many articles, but there is no clear demonstration of that. For example, in paradigms like the conditional place preference, which is the simplest that can be used, but nobody has ever demonstrated that an increase of trill calls is paired with preference for the drug pair environment, for example. So I think that the whole issue should be considered very carefully, at least with regard to studies of pharmacology, which are the ones that I am interested in.
Hey, Jeffrey.
Well, I think that we should just put this out here. There are clear ways to induce vocalizations in an animal that's closer to stereotypy or an ictal seizure behavior. You can get that clearly with super physiological, super pharmacological stimulation, definitely. My perspective, to think of Yak used to call it the neuroscience prediction. Is a laughing rat, is that a positive affect? Well, I'll know if my therapeutics and my diagnostics work. I always think about it as translational. Hopefully it translates. And I really sort of shifted in the last couple of years from thinking, oh, does the vocalization relate to emotion in a human, to more thinking, well, does a song, does this sort of vocalization relate to a human vocalization that I can measure? And is that drug sensitive, as a better way of looking at emotion? So I think it hopefully will supersede talking about emotional self-report. And sorry to keep on going on and on about the flaws of self-report, but from a person that is really close to the clinical literature on efficacy studies and measures of self-report measures of emotion, there's a real need to move away from that. And that's a sort of consensus of the field.
Okay, thank you. And also, Catherine, I don't know if you can speak freely, but you've made some good points in our chat, so perhaps you would like to, I don't know, read them at least out loud before we...
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I would say, when you think of internal state, which is what you're talking about when you're discussing emotions, then that should just be a state that is less likely to be influenced by the environment. So for example, are they in physical contact with another individual? Is there an aggressive interaction? Is there a sexual interaction? If it's not influenced by those social interactions, then it is more likely to be internal state. But if you have this modification of these vocalizations, then I think you can argue that this is indicative of a greater level of intent to communicate. We see that a lot in the California mice where, for example, certain vocalizations will predict future behaviors from the individual they're interacting with. That would again suggest that it's not just internal state. So I see why you want to look at emotions and in response to those drugs, but I think in order to really get at that, I think you need to look at more sophisticated analyses of behavior in order to get at that question. End of comment.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And again, just coming at it from birdsong, where, the sight of a female is a potent trigger for singing, yet the male will still sing when he's alone. One would say at first glance, there are almost no obvious differences in the vocal quality between those two states, but they're really fine-grained analysis. One can pull out very subtle differences, and then with behavioral assays show that those differences really matter for the female's responsiveness to the song. That is, she's much more stimulated by a song that's female directed than
and the internal state is Lauren Reeders has done a lot of work with birds, looking at how one is driven more by dopamine, the other one, and when it's not goal directed, is driven by opioids. And so yes, that social situation is critical. I would agree. And who the information is directed at. I thought there were subtleties in differences. Forgive me for not knowing all the research on that, but I thought there were some subtleties in the vocalizations, the bird song, when it's specifically female directed as compared to when they're, say, singing general advertisement. And I thought there was some variation, maybe in length of vocalizations or something.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But I would say it's subtle. And it's not in terms of type. It's not as if the bird has a special set of syllables that it pulls out for display and another set that it produces. I mean, it's really, 5% change in tempo, and rendition to rendition stereotypy declines, or variability declines about 30%. But it's so stereotyped to begin with that, again, if you weren't really quantifying it carefully, you would, one might miss it. So I'm only throwing it out there for the mouse and rodent crowd. I mean, if you're going to look for differences in vocal performance, if they're similarly subtle, it may not pop out at you.
I think that's a great point, and I think that duration is something that we have ignored. It's really popping up as being super important for both affiliative versus aggressive interactions in the California mice. So I think we're underestimating some of the subtleties in how these vocalizations are working. And I agree completely that quantification is critical. And there's some intermediate between looking at emotions and then analyzing every single vocalization and not being able to get function. And that's what, for some of the mouse work, that's become very difficult because there are so many different types. And it needs a very detailed ethological study to really get at what these vocalizations are and potentially get at what more of the variation means. And so, yeah, there's a happy intermediary in there somewhere.
Okay, Marcus, one last comment, as we're already unfortunately past our finish time.
Sorry, I just have a question for Catherine, actually. Can I ask a question?
Okay, yes.
Yeah, so this sounds very interesting. So I wonder, how do you actually differentiate between affective state, if you measure that at all, I don't know, and intention goal-directed, let's say goal-directed communication in the California mice?
That's a great question in terms of affective state. And I think that the best way to get at that, which we have not, which we're working on, but have not completely accomplished, is actually looking at how, when you vary neurochemicals, what response you're getting. And I think in some ways, because we have to be objective about it, it's very difficult to say what an internal state is, right? And so perhaps the best way is to take the drugs that have been used with humans, apply it to them, and see what kind of vocalizations you're getting. Otherwise, it's very difficult to assess internal state unless it's extreme. But certainly context still helps in that. So sorry I couldn't answer that better, but yeah.
Okay, thank you.